its structure and key provisions, and some of the current issues and challenges that face its implementation. So if you'll indulge me, we'll start with a bit of personal history. Back in 1984, I noticed a front page story in the New York Times entitled "Mississippi River Water Takes Prize." It described a national taste test of municipal drinking waters. Cities had flown in their drinking water from all over the country, and the winner was New Orleans, which takes its water from the Mississippi River right before it empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And I was pleased because New Orleans is one of my favorite towns. I thought it's great, it's getting good publicity like this. Then a couple months later, another article about New Orleans water appeared in the Wall Street Journal. And this was an investigative report. And here they reported a long list of synthetic organic chemicals, some of them carcinogens, found in the Mississippi River water that was used in New Orleans. And though one can't draw cause and effect from simple correlations, population in New Orleans had an incidence of cancer that was 21% above the national average. So this brought home to me a sort of fundamental point that taste buds alone are not enough to protect public health when it comes to drinking water. And indeed, it turns out that the water of New Orleans, the drinking water of New Orleans, was the impetus for the Safe Drinking Water Act. And this was a decade before those articles I read, back in 1974, or the early 70s, culminating in the act in 1974. EPA did a study of drinking water in New Orleans and found, again, a long list of synthetic organic chemicals, some of whom were probable or suspected carcinogens. That was picked up by Consumer Reports, which was published throughout the country, stuff rating their drinking water worst. And then a CBS much watched nighttime TV special on drinking water. All of this prompted Congress to say, hey, we got to do something about this. And they passed the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1974. So what does that act do? Well, first, what does it cover? It covers public water supplies, which actually covers public and private water systems with 15 or more hookups, or that supplies water to 25 or more people. And there are regulations for all these systems, but less stringent regulations for the smaller systems. It doesn't apply, just to be clear, it doesn't apply to, say, a store that supplies water to its customers and employees when they're on the premises. Nor does it apply to bottled water. It really applies to folks who actively provide water to others as a profit and nonprofit business. Now, the general approach of the Act is to set national standards for drinking water. And the Act does very little really to directly address the causes of drinking water contamination. Kind of deals with it after contamination and wants to clean it up before it comes into our taps. So these drinking water standards, these national standards, are set by EPA, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. There are primary standards, which are designed for the protection of public health. Compliance with primary standards is mandatory. And then there are secondary standards designed to protect public welfare, taste, color, things like that. Compliance with those standards is encouraged but voluntary. So the focus really is on the primary standards. And two things, break that down into two more subparts. There are two things set. First, there's a maximum contaminant level goal is set, and that is set based on health considerations alone. And so ordinarily what it is for any given contaminant, this is the maximum amount of that contaminant that's in water that's consistent with protection of health. And it's like I say, it's supposed to be set based on whatever the science tells us is enough to protect public health. Then what's actionable, what has to be met, is something called a maximum contaminant level, or the MCLs, as they're called. And these are based on technological and economic feasibility. Basically, they're to be set at the level sort of closest to the MCL goals that can be met by available and affordable technology. And in general, these things are set numerically, X concentration, milligrams per liter, micrograms per liter, that sort of thing, and set an allowable concentration of the particular contaminant, and is measured in the water supply, not basically sort of in the reservoir, if there's a reservoir, before it is pumped into homes. Now, since 1974, there have been a couple of major changes in the MCLs and the priority of them. So let me go through those. In 1986, 12 years after the act was initially passed, Congress was in a period of sort of environmental activism, you could call it that, because they passed a number of different statutes that strengthen environmental protection. And with the Safe Drinking Water Act, Congress was upset because EPA had set only a few maximum contaminant levels in its 10 years. So Congress got very specific, gave EPA a list of 83 chemicals and said, set maximum contaminant levels for these chemicals within 3 years. And then thereafter, set 25 more MCLs every 3 years. So a fairly aggressive timetable with specific instructions given to EPA. 10 years later, in 1996, the pendulum swung the other way. And in the amendments to the act that really were supported both by waterworks groups and municipalities and by environmentalists, EPA was told to forget about the 25 MCL per year level or requirement. That was no longer a requirement, and also gave them leeway to set the levels at something less than technological and economic feasibility if a cost-benefit analysis indicated that the social benefits of setting it more stringent would be outweighed by the social costs. So those part of it, made the act a bit weaker from a protection perspective and made it somewhat more difficult for EPA to set strong standards. At the same time, those amendments told EPA to put an emphasis on biological contamination because there'd been a big scare with what's crypto something or other, crypto something sporium. I can't get it right. Can't say it right.
Cryptosporidium.
Cryptosporidium. Thank you. I figured you'd type in and give me that. Thank you. And that was a big deal in Milwaukee, where a lot of people were taken sick. Some people died, and caught the attention of the country that, hey, it isn't just these synthetic industrial chemicals we have to worry about. We also have to worry about biological contaminants. Also, in that amendment, Congress told EPA to take a look at ways of protecting drinking water supplies from endocrine disrupting chemicals, with a special emphasis on that. Although that study ended up being done under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and not under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Okay, so those are the national standards. We'll come back to that when we look at copper and lead. But other parts of the act, there's kind of a right to know provision, reporting requirements. Water utilities must issue compliance reports to customers on a periodic basis and must specifically notify them if they aren't meeting the MCLs. This was thought to be a way to kind of enlist local communities in lobbying for cleaner drinking water. The notion being that unhappy customers would pressure their drinking water utilities to do better. And that still happens today. You still get these reports, and you can read in there what's being done with the drinking water. So it's a useful way to make the system transparent. And in some cases, it's led local pressure on local waterworks to make them invest more to clean up some parts of the drinking water supply. Another part of the act is it's separate, but it's the one part of the act up front that was meant to deal with causes of drinking water problems, and that's the underground injection well regulation. What this is, it sets up a federal program to regulate the injection of wastes, often liquid wastes, into deep underground wells. How does that relate to drinking water? Well, those wells, if they leak, can get into aquifers, and then those aquifers may very well end up being drinking water aquifers. The major change in that law that's happened through the years is that in 2004, Congress basically exempted, with one exception, exempted fracking operations from those requirements. So the stuff they inject, deep well inject as part of the fracking operations, are not covered by the underground injection well requirements. Sort of a decision made to prioritize energy development over water protection. And then finally, Congress set it up initially so that while EPA set the standards and did the oversight, states, if they wanted to, could take over operating the program, and most states have done this. Most states operate both the drinking water program, the setting of not the setting of the standards, but trying to enforce the standards, to implement the standards, and the underground injection program. Now, something that Congress realized had to happen as they got into this was needed special provisions for lead and copper. And here the big thing is that standards for lead and copper in drinking water are to be complied with and measured at the drinking water tap, not back in the reservoir. That's because the problem usually comes from the piping, the lead or copper used in the piping, and just measuring it back in the reservoir wouldn't give us the real picture. Of course, that's not enough to really solve the underlying problem of the lead and copper pipes. So Congress did a few things to address that as well. In 1986, as part of the 1986 amendments, Congress banned leaded pipes and set up a system for removing and replacing them over time, and also put limits on lead and solder in plumbing fixtures used for indoor piping. As you might imagine, it's easy to say that, more difficult to get these pipes removed and replaced over time. It's been a slow process, and EPA has been urged to take a greater effort to get the pipes removed more quickly and to try to get money to be used for that. EPA did act within the last few months here, at the waning end of the Trump administration. EPA issued a regulation in, I think, December 2020. It's now subject to court challenge, that reduced the percentage of lead pipes that need to be replaced each year. It used to be 7%, now they reduced it to 3%. EPA's explanation is, well, it never really was 3%. It always was just 1% because that's all we could do. So they put some things in here to try to provide incentives for utilities to actually do the testing and to do the removal. And EPA says they'll actually get a better result. The 3% will be a better result than the 1% they were getting. The environmental groups who challenge this are saying, well, 7% is more than twice 3%. You should stick with 7% and try to get that enforced. So the courts will tell us what happens there. Another relevant amendment of the law now, as opposed to regulation, was that back in the late 80s, Congress got a report that about more than 1 million drinking water fountains in schools and daycare centers either were known to have or were suspected to have lead piping. And Congress directed EPA to develop a program to eliminate lead contaminated piping, or at least to eliminate the lead contaminated drinking water in schools and daycare centers. Sometimes this would involve removal of pipes. Other times it would involve providing other supplies of water. Not much was specifically given as a mandate to EPA there, just an idea that that is a good thing to have happen. Which kind of leads us into my last little part about what are the issues and challenges involved with this statute. And I think the answer here is easy. It's money and infrastructure. We have the technology to provide healthy drinking water, or at least water that complies with the Safe Drinking Water Act, for pretty much everyone in the country who gets the drinking water from public water supplies. What it would take to do this, though, would be a massive influx of money to improve the infrastructure throughout water supply systems throughout the country. So that's a major financial investment. During the 1990s, several studies and reports indicated that There was widespread non-compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act just because municipalities lacked the money to do it. And then a survey released by EPA just at the turn of the century in 2001. EPA, they did something called the Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey, and they estimated that it would cost over the next 20 years, and that's culminating in about where we are now, it would cost about 150 billion to bring municipalities up to speed and compliance with the act. And many observers said, well, yeah, it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's probably going to cost a fair amount more than that. Many folks said that was an underestimate. So, I mean, in conclusion, the drinking water issue is like many environmental issues. It's a political problem. There may well be innovative technologies and methods that would reduce the cost here. We should obviously try to prioritize those and encourage their development and use. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a matter of mustering the necessary political will to spend the money to make the improved infrastructure happen.